What if I told you some spirits never left their graves, and tonight they might be watching you? If you love ghost stories, hit subscribe, tap like, and share this video so we can bring you even more terrifying tales. Subscribe, like, share to keep the ghosts coming. The first time I heard her name, it was whispered, almost apologetically, as though the speaker feared to summon something by accident. Mandy, not Amanda, not a name softened by affection, but Mandy, the blunt edge of a name that clung like the sharp crack of porcelain shattering on stone. It was late autumn in British Columbia when I found myself on the road to the town where the doll resided. The forests that lined the highway were ablaze with dying leaves, each gust of wind scattering them like sparks from a hidden fire. There was something unsettling about that drive. Though the sun hung low and golden, the shadows beneath the pines stretched long, sharp, almost predatory. I had traveled far, not only in distance but in purpose, seeking the truth of a story that refused to remain just a tale of a toy in folklore. Every haunted doll carries the residue of tragedy. Robert in Florida, Annabelle in Connecticut. These names echo across the paranormal world like storm clouds. But Mandy was different. Her story wasn't drenched in Hollywood exorcisms or theatrical curses. Hers was a quieter terror, a weeping in the night, a gaze that lingered too long, an unexplainable shifting of objects that should have remained still. It was precisely this subtlety that drew me to her. Subtlety, after all, is the most dangerous form of haunting. A scream can be braced against. A whisper slides beneath your skin. Unseen. The Quesnel and District Museum was smaller than I had imagined. Perched on the edge of the Fraser River, it looked like any other regional museum. Its exterior, neat, unassuming, almost quaint. Children's voices spilled from the entrance as families came to learn of the gold rush era, the fur trade, the early settlers. It seemed impossible that such an ordinary place housed something extraordinary, something that had drawn me across a continent. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and history. Artifacts lined the walls: sepia photographs, mining equipment, pioneer tools. The floors creaked beneath my steps, as though the building itself whispered its age. I walked deeper, past glass cases of arrowheads and rusty saws, until I reached the far wing where they said she was kept. And there she was. Mandy sat in a glass cabinet, her cracked porcelain face pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Her dress was tattered, Victorian lace, stained with time, but it was her eyes that caught me. Painted, yes, but alive in a way that mocked the idea of artifice. They followed me, no matter where I moved, and though I stood in a museum full of relics, surrounded by silence, I felt suddenly as though I were not alone. Beside the case, a small plaque read, "Mandy, the haunted doll, donated in 1991, said to move objects, cause disturbances, and cry in the night. Handled with care." A museum staff member, noticing my interest, approached with a half smile. "She's our star attraction, though not for the reasons you'd expect. People come from all over the world just to see her." I asked if she believed the stories. The smile faltered. "I've worked here 10 years. I've seen lights flicker, heard tapping from inside that case, and once I heard crying when I was alone here. I don't say I believe, but I don't say I don't either." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Don't stare too long. She doesn't like it." I left the museum with Mandy's gaze etched into my memory. That night, in a dim hotel room across town, I began piecing together her origins from dusty archives and local lore. The story began decades earlier. In the Caribou region, a farmer's wife had discovered the doll in the cellar of an abandoned farmhouse, wrapped in cloth, forgotten. From the moment she brought it home, strange things occurred. Windows left locked would creak open. Food disappeared from the pantry. Most disturbingly, the woman reported hearing the sound of a baby crying at night, though no child was in the house. Neighbors dismissed her stories until they, too, heard the cries while visiting. At last, unnerved, she brought the doll to the Quesnel Museum, almost begging the curators to take it. The disturbances, she claimed, ceased as soon as the doll was out of her home. But the museum staff were not spared. Soon after Mandy's arrival, objects vanished and reappeared elsewhere. Photocopiers malfunctioned. Volunteers refused to work alone near her. Even skeptics admitted to feeling watched. What disturbed me most was the crying. Always the crying. It came not as a scream, but as a soft, mournful wail. A child's grief, impossibly lodged in porcelain. To understand Mandy, I had to understand the nature of haunted dolls themselves. Dolls occupy a liminal space. They are human yet not human, familiar yet wrong. They mirror us in miniature, their painted eyes a mockery of life. Psychologists call this the uncanny valley, the discomfort that arises when something appears almost human, but not quite. But Mandy went beyond psychology. She was not merely eerie in appearance. She was active. She intruded on the physical world, moving objects, disrupting electronics, crying. She was not content to be a symbol of unease. She demanded attention. There is a theory in the paranormal world. Objects absorb energy. A doll, beloved by a child, becomes saturated with affection. But if tragedy befalls that child, the sorrow seeps into the doll like blood into cloth. Mandy, by all accounts, had drunk deeply of sorrow. I returned to the museum the next morning, determined to sit with her longer. The staff allowed me into the gallery before it opened to the public. Alone with Mandy, I sat on a wooden bench and simply watched. The room was still, the air heavy. I tried to rationalize my unease. She was just porcelain, just cloth. Yet the longer I stared, the more impossible it became to shake the feeling that she stared. And then I heard it, faint, almost too faint to register. A sound like soft sobbing, echoing from nowhere, everywhere. My blood ran cold. I stood, turning in circles, but the gallery was empty. The sound seemed to come from within the glass case itself. I stepped closer. Mandy's lips were painted in a faint smile, but in that moment they seemed cruel, mocking. Her eyes gleamed, and for a heartbeat, I swore they moved. The sobbing stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound had been. I left the gallery shaking. In the days that followed, I spoke with locals, gathering fragments of Mandy's legend. An elderly woman recalled visiting the farmhouse where Mandy had first been found. That house was never right, she said. The air in it felt thick, like breathing through cloth. When they tore it down, I thought the darkness would lift, but maybe it just moved. A former museum volunteer told me she once placed a pen beside Mandy's case. Minutes later, it was gone. She found it hours later in the basement. No one had been down there. Another story claimed a tourist, mocking the doll, snapped a photograph and jeered at her. Days later, his camera malfunctioned, the image corrupted. His trip was plagued with accidents: flat tire, a sprained ankle, a sudden illness. He left Quesnel pale, shaken, and unwilling to speak of Mandy again. Each account layered another shadow over her, until the doll became less an object and more a presence. What haunted me most was not the stories, but the silences between them. The way voices dropped when speaking of her. The pauses, as though words alone might draw her attention. Haunting, I realized, were not only in the events that occurred, but in the anticipation, the dread, the constant feeling that something could happen. Mandy thrived in that space between presence and absence, sound and silence, sight and blindness. She was not a scream in the night. She was the breath you hold when you think you are being watched. As the first week of my research ended, I felt Mandy's grip tightening. She was no longer confined to the museum. At night, in my hotel room, I dreamed of her. I saw her cracked face in the mirror, her glassy eyes watching from the corners. Once, I woke convinced I had heard soft tapping at my window, though I was 3 stories above the street. The doll had become a weight, following me, testing me. And yet, I could not turn away, for I had not come merely to observe Mandy. I had come to understand her, to peel back the porcelain mask and see what lay beneath. I did not yet know that in seeking her, I had already opened a door that could not easily be closed. The second week of my stay in Quesnel began with a storm. Heavy clouds rolled across the mountains, blotting out the sun, pressing the town beneath a sky the color of tarnished steel. Rain lashed against the windows of my hotel. The streets shimmered black, and the Fraser River boiled like a serpent in rage. It was in this atmosphere, wet, claustrophobic, restless, that my obsession with Mandy deepened. The first days had been marked by research and observation, but now the boundaries of research blurred. Mandy was no longer just a subject. She was a presence, whispering at the edges of thought, moving like a shadow at the corner of vision. And in those restless nights, I began to realize that the doll's story was not confined to the museum. It bled outward, staining everything it touched. It began innocuously enough, the sound of crying the first time. I had convinced myself it was a dream. The second, I told myself it was a trick of the wind. But by the third night, there was no denying it. Around 2:13 a.m., always the same time, the sound returned. Soft, high-pitched, the unmistakable cry of a baby, muffled as though behind walls. I sat up in bed, my pulse pounding, listening to the sound thread itself through the rain outside. The hotel was nearly empty. The receptionist had told me earlier that only 2 other guests occupied the building. No children, no infants. The cries grew louder until I felt them vibrate in my chest. I stumbled to the window, throwing it open, but the street below was empty, slick with rain. The sound wasn't outside, it was inside. Behind me. I turned slowly, my skin prickling with cold, and there on the chair in the corner of the room sat a shape I had not placed there. A doll, cracked porcelain, tattered dress. My heart seized. I blinked, and the chair was empty. The crying stopped. I slept with the lights on. In the following nights, Mandy entered my dreams, not as a doll, but as something larger, more human, yet distorted. I saw a child standing at the edge of a cellar, her face obscured, her hands clutching something to her chest. I saw water pooling at her feet, seeping upward, swallowing her until only the doll remained above the surface. Another night, I dreamt of the museum. I walked through the darkened gallery, glass cases looming like tombstones. Mandy's cabinet was open, empty. I turned, and there she was, standing at the far end of the hall, not sitting, not held, standing. Her head tilted, eyes gleaming in the dark. When I awoke, my sheets were damp with sweat, and on the nightstand beside me lay a scrap of paper torn from my notebook, though I had no memory of writing on it. Scrawled in my own hand, in uneven letters, were the words, "Don't leave her alone." My attempts to distance myself from Mandy only pushed me deeper into her orbit. Locals who had previously dismissed my questions began to open up, each story adding a thread to the growing tapestry of dread. One man, a retired janitor who once worked at the museum, described hearing voices in the basement after hours. It sounded like a child talking to someone, he said, his eyes clouding with memory. But when I opened the door, there was nobody there, just the doll in her case, upstairs. But I swear to God, I could still hear her voice faintly, like she was finishing a conversation. A former staff member confessed that she avoided walking past Mandy alone. "She doesn't like women," she whispered. "I always felt angrier energy when I was near her. Things would go missing from my desk, but only when I was working late. It was like she wanted me gone." And then there was the priest. Father McKenna had served in Quesnel for over 30 years. When I asked about Mandy, he was silent for a long time, his hands tightening around the arms of his chair. Finally, he said, "There are spirits that linger because they cannot let go, and there are spirits that linger because they will not let go. The difference is subtle, but crucial. I do not think Mandy is simply lost. I think she is holding on, and whatever she is holding, she will not release it easily." By the 3rd week, Mandy's presence was no longer confined to the night. During the day, as I walked the streets of Quesnel, I felt her, in the shifting shadows between buildings, in the sudden coldness of the air, even beneath the sun. Once, while sipping coffee at a small cafe, I felt the unmistakable sensation of tiny fingers brushing against my wrist. I spilled the drink, the liquid staining the table like spreading blood. The waitress rushed over to help, but when I stammered an explanation, she only gave me a look of recognition. "You've been to the museum, haven't you?" she asked. I nodded. She pursed her lips. "Be careful. Mandy doesn't stay put." It began with small things. A pen rolling off the desk when there was no slope. A book shifting slightly from where I had placed it. I tried to explain it away, drafts, vibrations from footsteps, my own carelessness. But soon the movements grew bolder. One evening, while writing in my notebook, I set the pen down to stretch. When I looked back, the pen was gone. I searched the room, lifting sheets, checking beneath the desk. Nothing. Hours later, when I went to brush my teeth, the pen lay across the bathroom sink. Another time, I returned to my room to find my suitcase unzipped, clothes strewn across the floor. No one had entered. The lock on the door was untouched, and the hotel security cameras showed no disturbance. It was as though someone or something was growing bolder, testing boundaries, asserting presence. And always, I felt the same sensation, the weight of eyes on me, driven by equal parts fear and obsession. I returned to the museum once more, determined to confront Mandy directly. This time, I brought a small recorder, hoping to capture what I had heard before. The gallery was quiet, the cases gleaming in dim light. I sat before her cabinet again, pressing record. "Mandy," I whispered, feeling absurd. "If you are here, can you show me?" Silence. I sat for minutes, heart pounding, waiting. Then tap, tap, tap. A soft, deliberate sound against the glass of her cabinet. I froze. The sound came again, rhythmic, patient. I lifted the recorder, whispering again, "Do you want me here?" The room grew colder. The hairs on my arms rose. And then, clear as water poured in the dark, came the faintest sound of a cry, off, sorrowful, unmistakable. The recorder crackled. I let it run until the sound faded, my breath shallow. When I played it back later, the taps were audible. The cry was faint, but present. Proof. Or perhaps a warning. From that night forward, everything escalated. The cries no longer came only at 2:13 a.m. They came at dusk. At dawn, even in the middle of the day, I would be writing, and the sound would drift through the room, impossible to place. Like a phantom child weeping in the walls. Objects no longer merely moved, they fell. Once, a glass of water on my desk tipped and shattered, the shards spreading like ice. Another time, a chair toppled while I sat feet away. I began to hear whispers, distinct, female, sometimes childlike, sometimes older. They never spoke full sentences, only fragments, as though the voice belonged to someone trapped in endless repetition. "Don't leave. Why did you?" Alone, each night, I dreamed of cellars, water, and the hollow sound of porcelain cracking. Asterisk. It was Father McKenna who offered the explanation I dreaded most. I told him of the voices, the movements, the crying. His face grew pale, the lines around his eyes deepening. "She is following you," he said simply. I protested. "Mandy was locked in the museum. She couldn't leave." But he shook his head. "Objects are vessels. Spirits are not confined to glass or stone. If she has attached to you, it is not the doll that follows. It is what is inside it." The thought hollowed me. I had not only studied Mandy, I had invited her, and now she had come. The final night of part 2 came like the crashing of a wave. I had returned to my hotel late, exhausted, determined to sleep. But at 2:13 a.m., the crying began again, this time louder, closer. I rose, trembling, whispering into the dark, "What do you want?" The crying stopped. Silence pressed against the room. And then, in the corner of the chair again. This time, she was there, not imagined, not half seen. Mandy sat in the chair, her cracked face gleaming in the dark, her painted eyes reflecting the faint glow of the lamp. I could not move, her head tilted slowly, impossibly, as though acknowledging me. And then, from that porcelain mouth, came a whisper, "Don't leave me." The light flickered, the air grew cold as winter. And then she was gone. The chair sat empty once more. But I knew utterly, without question, that I was no longer alone. The night that began with whispers ended with screams, though not the kind one could easily explain. It was not a scream of flesh torn, nor of mortal injury, but of something deeper, a soul rending itself against the iron bars of silence, demanding to be heard. Mandy had waited long enough by now. The doll no longer required the stillness of glass. She roamed, first in the corners of vision, then in the folds of dream, then in the air itself. The museum staff whispered about her with voices strained and tired. Some swore they heard her humming a lullaby that no one alive knew, a tune that carried the damp scent of cellars and the distant drip of water. Others found her placed differently than before. Her head turned just enough to meet their gaze when they returned to the room. What no one dared to speak aloud was the sense that Mandy was multiplying not in body, but in presence. It was as though one doll sat behind the glass, another hovered in the hallway shadows, another lingered in the bathroom mirror, and yet another curled in the minds of those foolish enough to lock eyes with her button-black stare. Eleanor was the first to admit it. "She's not staying put," she whispered to John, the night watchman who had replaced Alan after his sudden breakdown. "I feel her, even when I'm home. It's like she's leaking out of the building." John tried to laugh it off, but his eyes betrayed a tremor. "You're imagining things." But he, too, had begun to notice. The lights flickered in his apartment. His daughter claimed a doll had whispered her name while she slept. His wife found tiny handprints on the bathroom mirror, as though a child had pressed against it with damp fingers. Mandy's reach was stretching. The town of Quesnel itself began to change. Small things at first, dogs refusing to pass by the museum, the church bell ringing without cause, shadows flitting through the pine trees, though the air was still. Children began dreaming of a cellar they had never seen, where water dripped and something with porcelain skin and hollow eyes waited in the dark. Parents grew restless, sleepless, irritable. It was as though the entire town was caught in a net of whispers, and the source of the threads was clear to all, though none wished to say it. The curator called in a priest, Father Mal, a man hardened by decades of ritual and seasoned by encounters with superstition across remote towns. He entered the museum armed with prayer, holy water, and a crucifix carved from cedar. When he stood before Mandy's case, he felt the air contract, as though every breath was being weighed and judged. He lifted his hand, began the rite, and then faltered. Mandy's glass trembled. It was not the tremor of fragile material, but the vibration of something unseen pressing outward. The lights died. The temperature plummeted. Father Malakis's voice cracked. Not from fear, but from force. Something invisible seized his throat. His crucifix grew hot. He dropped it to the floor where it smoldered like coal. "She does not want me here," he gasped, stumbling back, his cassock torn by unseen claws. "This is older than what I serve, older and deeper." He left before dawn, never to return. But where religion retreated, curiosity pressed forward. Paranormal investigators arrived, armed with their gadgets, EMF meters, spirit boxes, thermal cameras. They set up in the museum overnight, determined to capture Mandy's essence. Their recordings yielded results none of them anticipated. The EMF meters spiked violently, not in bursts but in steady waves, as though an engine of energy pulsed from the doll herself. The spirit box crackled with voices, layered, fragmented, multiple. Some wept, some laughed, some chanted nonsense syllables, and one, clear and sharp, spoke in a child's voice. "Don't let her out." But it was already too late. During the long hours between 2 and 3 in the morning, the investigators witnessed Mandy vanish from her case. Not topple, not fall, but vanish, leaving behind an imprint on the dust. The glass door unlocked without sound. Panic surged. They searched the museum, every corridor, every room, but she was nowhere. Then one of them, a young woman named Carla, screamed. Mandy was standing in the middle of the hallway. Not lying, not cradled, but standing, her head tilted too far to one side. Her mouth, once sewn, now gaped open as if something had chewed the threads from within. The group fled. Carla never spoke again of that night. She lost her job, her health, her sleep. Neighbors said they saw her in her window at night, whispering to someone unseen. Within months, she vanished, leaving only a child's lullaby recorded on her answering machine. The museum tried to contain the panic. They locked Mandy back in her case, doubled the glass, reinforced the locks. But what is a cage to something that does not need doors? Mandy was no longer bound by the material. She had ascended or descended into something else. Eleanor dreamed vividly now, each night more terrible than the last. She found herself standing in that cellar, the one Mandy came from. Water dripping, rats skit, and always the sound of crying, a baby's cry, sharp and endless. When she approached, she found the doll lying on the ground, face cracked, arms outstretched. But behind the doll was something larger, something unseen, bending the shadows into shapes too grotesque to hold. One night, Eleanor woke to find her hands covered in dirt. She had no memory of digging, yet outside, in her garden, a small hole had been clawed into the earth, as though something inside her had been commanded to unearth what was buried by now. Even skeptics confessed unease. Rational minds failed to contain the phenomenon. It was not just Mandy's haunting of the museum, it was Mandy's possession of the town itself. The forest grew hostile. Visitors spoke of getting lost, of hearing children calling their names among the trees. A hunter returned without eyes, claiming he had seen a doll the size of a woman in the underbrush. He never spoke again. The climax arrived with the storm. A tempest tore through Quesnel one autumn night. Lightning clawing the heavens, thunder splitting the hills. Power failed. The town sank into blackness, and in that blackness, Mandy walked. She appeared on porches, in kitchens, in bedrooms. Families swore she watched them sleep, her cracked porcelain face dripping with cellar water. The town's phones rang simultaneously at midnight, every line. When residents answered, they all heard the same thing, the sound of a baby crying. In the museum, Eleanor stood before Mandy's case as the storm raged. Her reflection quivered on the glass. But it was not her reflection. It was another version of her, smiling faintly, holding the doll like a child. The glass burst. The doll fell into Eleanor's arms, heavier than it should have been, warm as though filled with blood. A voice coiled in her skull. "You carried me once. You'll carry me again." And Eleanor, against her will, began to sing the lullaby. the one no one alive remembered, the one Mandy had been humming all along. The sound filled the museum, seeped into the storm, drowned the thunder. It was not beautiful. It was not maternal. It was the song of something ancient pretending to be human, something that demanded recognition, demanded to be rocked and soothed, though it had never been a child. The storm broke at dawn. The town woke in silence, the air heavy with ash. The museum was in ruins, the case shattered. Eleanor was gone. Mandy, too. Only a wet lullaby echoed through the hall, recorded by the investigators' abandoned equipment. And yet the glass, broken as it was, bore handprints from the inside, damp, desperate. Morning should have brought safety. The storm had passed, and the sky stretched pale and colorless, the way it does after nature has burned itself empty. But Quesnel did not wake to relief. It woke to silence and eerie stillness, more suffocating than the roar of thunder. Birds did not sing, dogs did not bark. The streets lay deserted, as though every inhabitant had chosen, or been forced, to remain indoors. At the museum, debris littered the floors, shards of glass, fragments of wood, splintered displays, yet no one dared enter. A crowd gathered at a distance, eyes fixed on the blackened building that had once housed relics of history. They did not speak of the woman who had vanished. They did not speak of the doll. Their silence was ritual, instinctive. To name the thing was to summon it. The investigators who had survived the storm replayed their recordings. The evidence was undeniable. On every camera, every microphone, the lullaby could be heard, woven into the thunder like a parasite clinging to sound itself. Worse still were the images, shadows that stretched unnaturally, faces appearing where there should have been none, and at the center of it all, Mandy, moving when no hand touched her, tilting her head toward the lens with unnatural intimacy, as if peering straight through the glass into the heart of the viewer. But Eleanor's absence weighed most heavily. Her name was whispered in the town like a prayer, or perhaps a curse. Some claimed she had been taken, absorbed into Mandy's essence. Others said she had fled, carrying the doll with her into the wilderness. A few believed she had become something else entirely, neither alive nor dead, neither human nor ghost, but the chosen vessel of Mandy's ceaseless hunger. Days bled into weeks. The museum sealed the exhibit, refusing further entry. But shutting a door does not end a haunting. The staff still heard footsteps echoing in the empty halls, small and deliberate, as though a child padded just out of sight. Shadows passed under doors. Phones rang in the dead of night with the soft wail of an infant before the line fell silent. Worse were the personal hauntings. Staff reported waking to find damp handprints on their windows, too small to be their own children's. One woman awoke, choking, her throat filled with the stench of stagnant water, only to cough up a strand of thread, the kind once sewn across Mandy's mouth. Stories spread, not just within Quesnel, but far beyond. Visitors came, drawn by morbid curiosity, by whispers of the ghost doll that had outgrown her case. They brought offerings, toys, trinkets, notes scrawled with pleas. Some left candy, believing the doll was appeased by sweetness. Others left crucifixes, sage, or small packets of salt. The offerings disappeared. None knew if they were accepted or devoured. Folklore blossomed like mold in damp places. One version said Mandy was not haunted by a single child's spirit, but by many, bound together in grief, their cries unified in one cracked porcelain shell. Another whispered that she was not the ghost of a child at all, but of something far older, wearing the mask of a toy the way a wolf wears the skin of prey. And always, the lullaby. It began to haunt recordings of people who had never visited Quesnel. Tourists returned home and played back their vacation footage, only to hear the faint drip of water and a baby's cry threaded through their laughter. Paranormal forums lit up with tales of dolls moving in locked cabinets, of porcelain eyes that followed their owners, of dreams that ended with a cellar door creaking open. A pattern emerged. Once you heard of Mandy, you could not unhear her. It was not the doll alone that was haunted, it was the story itself. To know her name was to open the door a fraction, to allow the lullaby to seep through. John, the night watchman who had once dismissed the warnings, began to unravel. He confessed to seeing Eleanor in his dreams, rocking Mandy in her arms, whispering in a voice that was not her own, "It's your turn now." He begged to be released from his post. But when he left town, he found the doll waiting in every shadow. A porcelain figure appeared in the rearview mirror of his car, standing on the road behind him. No matter how far he drove, he was last seen parked on a mountain overlook, muttering a lullaby to the empty air. The town itself began to fracture. Businesses closed. Families moved away. Those who remained grew gaunt, hollow-eyed, as though their vitality was draining drop by drop. Children drew pictures of Mandy in school, always the same tilted head, the same hollow stare, the same stitched mouth, though none had been told what she looked like. One child claimed Mandy visited her at night and asked to be sung to sleep. Days later, the child vanished from her bed without a trace. Panic might have spurred the museum to destroy the doll, but fear paralyzed them. For every story of cursed objects broken or burned, there were darker tales of what followed the spirit loosed, freed from its vessel, no longer bound by porcelain or glass. So Mandy remained, contained but uncontained, locked but not imprisoned, her glass coffin both shield and shrine. The climax of fear came when the museum tried to relocate her. Perhaps distance would weaken her hold, they reasoned. The staff arranged for the doll to be transported to a research facility in Vancouver. The morning of the move, the van assigned to carry her was found overturned on the side of the road. The driver was alive but incoherent, babbling about a child's voice in the back seat, a song that made him steer off the highway. The crate was intact. The doll sat inside, her head tilted just a little farther than before, as though she were listening closely. From that day on, no one attempted to move her again, and so Mandy remained. The years stretched forward, and the town learned to live with her shadow. She became both curse and attraction, drawing the curious even as she repelled the faithful. Paranormal television shows filmed segments that left their hosts pale and trembling. Writers spun books around her legend. Tourists posed for photographs outside her exhibit, daring each other to lock eyes with her. But the longer one gazed, the harder it became to look away. Some said her eyes were changing. They no longer seemed like painted glass, but like wells, deep and wet, reflecting movements that did not belong to the world outside the case. Some swore they saw children's faces flicker across her surface, like reflections in water. Others claimed they glimpsed their own faces, not as they were, but as they would be aged, hollowed, lifeless. And always, always, the lullaby that seeped into the walls of the museum, into the soil of Quesnel, into the bones of those who dared remember. It could be heard in the hush before sleep, in the static of radios, in the hush between heartbeats. Not a song of comfort, but of endless need, a hunger that no cradle could soothe. Mandy did not leave. She did not need to. She had spread beyond the limits of her body. She was no longer confined to porcelain. She was a story, and stories travel. To know her name is to feel her presence. To read her tale is to invite the lullaby into your dreams. And when you dream, you may find yourself in a cellar you've never seen, damp and dripping, the air filled with the cry of something that should have been comforted but never was. A doll waits in the shadows, head tilted, eyes wide, arms open. She will not move, not yet, but she is waiting. And when you wake, you may find your window fogged with breath that is not your own. Mandy's story cannot close. It resists endings, because endings are a form of peace, and she was never given peace. Instead, her tale is a circle, a lullaby without conclusion, a haunting that grows each time her name is spoken. She remains in her glass case in Canada. Perhaps she doesn't. Perhaps she is already beside you, reflected faintly in the corner of your eye, listening, waiting for the moment when silence stretches too long. And then you will hear it, the drip of water, the cry of a child, the lullaby